Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Hello, and welcome to day 3 of our Satipatthana Sutta studies. In a minute, I'm going to ask you all a very important question. I'm going to ask you to ponder something. But first, that's a teaser. Before I ask you a very important question, I wanted to just kind of review where we've been with this study. So we started by looking at the introduction to the sutta, and that the Buddha himself says, this is the way that leads to the end of suffering. What I'm getting ready to show you is the way that works. So do this, and you'll liberate yourself from suffering. And how did he say to do that? Well, the first section was on the breath. And we looked at anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. And he gave us a tool and taught us how to meditate for the first time, maybe, right? You think about a lot of people read this first time they do anything like this. He says, here's what you're going to do. You're just going to learn to be present to what your breath is doing and what your body's doing. You're going to stay present and mindful, and you're going to watch whether you take a long or short breath. And that's where he starts. And he gives us a couple of things in there that then immediately start to show us some truth. That it's transient, that there's a place where my mind is present and a place where my mind is not present. And he teaches us to use this technique to calm our body and calm our minds so that we can look deeply. And then the second thing he teaches us is to start by looking deeply at your body, that you can look at your body from head to toe and examine it and see it for what it is. It's made up of parts, it's made up of elements, that these are coming together in a certain way, that we all experience that similarly, and that part of that is that it is transient, just like our breath was. It comes and goes, and it maybe takes a long time, maybe takes a short time, but eventually we all turn to dust. And he walks us right through that whole picture of looking at our body. And he shows us a few things. He shows us, again, transience. He shows us that there's nothing to be afraid of, that it's common for everybody. He shows us what's actually happening, and he gives us a sense of that anicca, anatta, and dukkha, that things are impermanent, that they are not self, and that they are not satisfactory, that there's not a satisfactory state. And so, with that review, I'm going to ask you your most important question. How are you feeling? Now, think about that just a second. Really think, how are you feeling today? And then let me ask you to think deeply about, how did you come to that answer? So, just by a show of hands, when I said, how are you feeling? Who kind of thought primarily about a physical sense? If you thought about your physical body. And if I ask you, how are you feeling? Who primarily thought about your mental state? And so there we see a couple of things. In just that question, we become mindful of what's happening right now. And we see something that we can relate to that we call a feeling, physical and or mental. And as we're doing that, we're doing it at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, just after we practice meditation. So if I asked you that same question on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, how would your answer have been? Or how about 4:30 a.m. Monday morning? How are you feeling? Right? And so we're going to examine feelings today. And in fact, this part about feelings and mind are two separate but connected sections in the Satipatthana Sutta. And I'll tell you, I've mentioned before that to me, we're getting ready to enter what has been the most paradigm shifting, life altering piece of Buddhism for Pete the Buddhist. That for this piece is the one that I look at the most and say, wow, it really changed the way that I relate to my own lifetime. So I do want to go slowly and I want to look at it, and we might not get to both parts today. We might, I meant to, it's on kind of our schedule, but who cares? We're going to see how it unfolds. But we're going to start with Vedana, and that's the mind. And so I'm going to share the sutta. Or I'm sorry, I said mind. We're going to start with feelings for Dana. And how does a monk remain focused on feelings in and of themselves? There is a case where a monk, when feeling a painful feeling, discerns, I am feeling a painful feeling. When feeling a pleasant feeling, they discern, I am feeling a pleasant feeling. When feeling neither painful nor pleasant feeling, they discern, I am feeling neither painful nor pleasant feeling. And I'm going to stop just right there and talk about that as the three things he says to look for. Is it painful, pleasant, or neither painful or unpleasant? Yep. So it's funny to me, but every time I share my screen, Zoom immediately blocks my screen, so I can't see it. So these are the three, and with their Pali terms. So pleasant feelings, sukha. These include any forms of pleasant physical or mental sensations. Unpleasant feelings, dukkha. These encompass all forms of pain, discomfort, or unpleasant mental states. And neutral feelings, I don't even know if I can pronounce it, adukkha masukha, and that's sensations that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and often overlooked but little recognized in mindful practice for their subtle presence. So, back to the. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
I was just looking at the construction of the word. It's similar to a Greek word I encountered about when you say a black and white cat. It's basically neither, right? Dukkha, unpleasant. Some word, sukha, pleasant. So
right.
Presumably it's like neither unpleasant or pleasant sensation.
You're right. I just got scared when I saw the big word.
I understand.
So it's not dukkha and it's not sukha. So it's neither of these two things. And yeah, I'm glad you chimed in, because I want to come back to group discussion here for a minute and kind of think about this. So when we go back to when I first asked the question, how are you feeling? And then I asked, how did you come to your answer? Would you say that when you noted that feeling, was it dukkha, sukha, or neither? Anybody want to share?
You know, and if this derails the conversation, then so be it. But yeah, it's an interesting to note, because it's like, how are you feeling? So first off, you would say, I have an experience, and I call it experience of feeling. And then it's like, okay, so it's a feeling. What kind of feeling is it? Right? Is it a pleasant feeling? Oh, my shoulder hurts. Oh, it's not a pleasant feeling. It's a dukkha feeling.
Right.
But I'm feeling relaxed and content. Well, that's an emotional, pleasant feeling. And then you can have like, and I feel the wool socks on my feet. They're neither warm nor cold, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. They are just what they are.
True. I agree. I think that doesn't derail the conversation. I think you're just illustrating the point. I think that's exactly correct. Somebody else? Vicky, you got anything?
Well, when you first asked the question, my first reaction to it was, I feel peaceful. I gave it that word, but as I thought about it, or kind of explored it a bit, it was more neutral. And that was the word I could apply to neutral. And I got confused, because some people may see peaceful as like wonderful, and some wonderful thing. But it's more a neutral. it's at peace, or it's at kind of a middle or something like that.
Equanimous, we might
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. It wasn't like, oh, yay, I'm at peace. It was just,
And you
fairly.
make a good point, because there's a lot of stuff in this as we study this where it's like, yeah, we're just talking about neutral. We're just talking about peaceful. We're not talking about our heads don't glow or anything. There's misunderstanding about this in our culture, but also, I think just this question, how are you today? You get that. How many times a day do you get that? You're in the check stand. The cashier really wants to get through their day, and I'm not sure they actually want to hear everything that's going on. So fine, I'm fine, or I'm doing great. And there actually becomes even pressure to, when you're asked how you feel, to say something positive, right?
Right.
And so a lot of times just that question, how do you feel, can be like not something that we actually genuinely offer any introspection on, but just as our social reaction to what's happening.
It's more a greeting more than a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you got, Victor?
Well, I've had a bad week. I had a severe back strain, been to the doc a couple times, PT. And at some point, I think when the guy was working on me, I kind of thought, pain is the definition of self. It was just really kind of takes over. Pain is, I think, kind of a unique feeling in a lot of ways. Our whole body hurts. It challenges your idea of feelings, challenges your idea of physical disability, which it's one of the things that the Buddha first saw, right? He saw somebody sick, saw somebody dead.
Right. You're seeing the change, and you're seeing the physical feeling that is happening in the body, but you're also seeing that you're having mental feelings in relation to that. And yeah, it's a lot. And pain can be, I remember I injured my shoulder once, and I referred to it as white hot, because it's all I could see. Right. And I closed my eyes, and all I could see is that pain. And so I know what you mean. And the little bit of solace I'd say, Victor, is know that it's transient, that it's going to change. Right. That's another part of this. So
yeah.
We haven't heard from Wayne yet. Wayne, you got anything you'd like to add?
Only this, that when I think about how do you feel, there's actually a physical component to even your mental states and conditions. When something occurs that causes you to react in a certain way, depending on what happened, what precedes that is an actual physical sensation. We aren't always aware of that. We are not always see it. We don't always, like I say, we're not always aware of it. And we train ourselves this way, at least that's what I've come to understand, so that I can then become and get in touch with those feelings as they arise. And when they proceed in emotion, sometimes I can quell the emotion because I see it arising before it actually occurs.
I think you're spot on there.
How do you feel? That's why when you said, was it a body sensation or was it a mental sensation? What did you mean? And I rose my hand with body.
Yeah. I think I can see both. I can see certainly, like Victor says, the pain comes to your back or your shoulder, and then some very difficult other emotions can arise as a result of that pain. Similarly, I can have an emotional state happen. I can get my heart broken, and then have physical things happen because I got my heart broken, right? That's why we call it heartbreak. And so, like, I can be upset in my stomach. I can get a migraine. I can cry a lot and have the physical things that come from crying. So I think that you can see that both can be attached to each other. And so with that, I think this is the perfect place to pick up with the sutta. So when feeling a painful feeling of the flesh, he discerns, I'm feeling a painful feeling of the flesh. When feeling a painful feeling not of the flesh, he discerns, I'm feeling a painful feeling not of the flesh. When feeling a pleasant feeling of the flesh, he discerns, I am feeling a pleasant feeling of the flesh. When feeling a pleasant feeling not of the flesh, he discerns, I am feeling a pleasant feeling not of the flesh. When feeling a neither painful nor pleasant feeling of the flesh, he discerns, I am feeling neither a painful nor pleasant feeling of the flesh. When feeling neither painful nor pleasant feeling not of the flesh, he discerns, I am feeling this not of the flesh. And so we talked about that. So he makes that same observation that we kind of all just did, that we see that there is both physical and mental pain. In this way, he remains focused internally on feelings in and of themselves, or externally on feelings in and of themselves, or both internally and externally on feelings in and of themselves, and remains focused on the phenomena of origination with regard to the feelings, on the phenomena of the passing away with regard to the feelings, or the phenomena of origination and passing away with regard to the feelings. Or his mindfulness that there are feelings is maintained to the extent of knowledge and remembrance, and he remains independent, unsustained, anything in this world. This is how a monk remains focused on feelings in and of themselves. So that piece, again, the same as what we've seen in the other sections, to say that you see this, but don't necessarily get attached to it. And that brings me to this quote from the Dhammapada. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not from the Dhammapada. That's another quote I'm going to use later. This quote is actually mentioned several times in the Majjhima Nikaya in different places. When one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one does not delight in it, welcome it, and remain holding it, then the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feelings does not lie within one. When one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one does not sorrow, grieve, and lament, does not weep, beating one's breast and become distraught, then the underlying tendency to aversion for painful feelings does not lie within one. So looking at feelings, we see, kind of like we did in these other sections, that there's something that we don't pay attention to a lot of the time, that exists all of the time. Just like your breath, just like your body, it's there and it comes and goes in this very transient state. Sometimes we identify with feelings, I think, particularly emotional feelings, and build a self out of that more than maybe any other thing, because we so like our pleasant feelings that we really want more of those. That seems like that's what the game's about. We want to have all the best pleasant feelings. And as Vicky pointed out, that's not necessarily what peace is. Peace is not necessarily either of those, and not necessarily even the neutral part. So when we look at it and he has us identifying this, he's again training us, like he did with the breath, like he did with the body, to see the constituents, to understand their parts, and to examine them carefully. And just in a few minutes, just in one question, we dug pretty deeply on feelings. But I do think I want to wait to talk about the next section, mind, until next week, just so that we can give this enough space to talk about and look at a little bit. The last thing I'd like to point out on this is that discussion of neutral feelings, we really don't put any, it's like we don't put any credit on neutral as an experience we haven't. It may be that we experience that, I don't really know, maybe more than any of the other aspects, right? And so we don't really pay attention to neutral. As long as we're neutral, we don't have anything to worry about, because we're not feeling something unpleasant and we're not feeling something pleasant. So we don't have anything to try to grasp, and we don't have anything to hold on to. So we're just, right? What do you think, Chris?
What I was going to say is, it's kind of interesting. It's perhaps there is a ubiquity of the feelings that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant, right? Because a feeling that's neither pleasant nor unpleasant, whether mental or physical, doesn't draw your attention the way that a pleasant or an unpleasant feeling draws. And so on a first pass, one might say, oh, they're just pleasant and unpleasant feelings, because they don't even know, they're not even paying attention to the fact that there are these other feelings. An example of this would be, we talk about the 5 tastes that the tongue has, right? And for most of human history, we only recognized 4. We didn't recognize the 5th one, the savory one, right? The one that, the guy who invented the umami, right? We didn't recognize it because it was there all the time. It was always driving the food stuff, right? But things that were bitter or salty or sweet or sour would provoke extreme reactions as opposed to content reactions.
Yeah, and amazing. Look at all the things that happen in that short amount of space. Like when you really start looking with the same concentration as you do with your breath, as the same concentration as when we break down the body, amazing amount of stuff in a short amount of space. For me, the movements of feelings and mind are much more transient than my physical experience. And so it's a place where I see that transience really clearly. It moves from one to the other. And I think when you fall into not seeing neutral, it's as if we're going along and then for a long time I was sad, or for a short time I was happy. And it's kind of how we relate to it. But the truth is that it's all movement from one to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other, just one after another. And we see that clearly as we start to break it down into its parts.
One other thing that this conversation has had me consider is when we are identifying the feeling, right? I was thinking about this earlier this week, sitting out and noticing it was cold, right? And so in the wintertime, when you experience cold, it's not pleasant. But the assessment that this is bad is layered on top of an experience that this is not pleasant, right?
Right.
And so it's like a piece of this kind of goes to that final statement we were reading about the monk that holds on to, like when you hold on to the experience, right? You go, this is pleasant. And you make the assessment. Yeah, I want to hold on to it.
Right.
Well, you have the experience like that's painful. Ouch! I want to get away from it. It's in a moment where you make the assessment and add something to it that it becomes something that'll like knock you off your balance.
Right. Well said. And that's why I like the group discussion stuff, because I like to hear what other people have to add, because your points are all perfect. And I think that when we looking at this last point, think about in your meditation, and when you have a good meditation or a not good meditation, right? Maybe you had a good session today, maybe you didn't. And if you don't feel like you did, what is it? Is it because your mind's all over the place? Because everything's super movement? Because what he's saying here is there isn't a time when it's not appropriate to be mindful. That it's appropriate to be mindful when your mind is anxious. That it's appropriate to be mindful when your mind is at peace. That it's appropriate to be mindful when you're, seeing the transience. That it's appropriate for you to be mindful when you feel like that backache isn't ever going to go anywhere. And what he's saying is in that last set of phrases that we repeat in every one of these is that there's not a time when mindfulness doesn't apply. It's not like you're being mindful when you're concentrated, or you're being mindful when you're having happy feelings. You're being mindful anytime you see it. Anytime you see it. And there's not a time where it doesn't make sense to do so. Walking us through, if you go back to like the first day I started giving these talks, I used the example of cleaning out the garage. And that we open up the garage and we got a big mess, and we got to sort those piles into different groups. And by sorting it into different groups, we can really evaluate what it is and in short order make it go away. And it's exactly what we're still doing. We sorted into the physical aspects of the body. We're now looking at the mental aspects, and we're looking at what they actually are and how they function. And like you point out, a lot of times we're not even aware, not aware of that sense is there, because our default is so ingrained that we're going to remain that neutral is fine, or that as long as I'm not unhappy, that's fine, that we become kind of obsessed about the times when we're clinging in a verse 2. But they all move from one to the other. Wayne points out the physical turns into mental, and it's not a single thing that's happening, but we begin to see that by looking at all these pieces put together, So I've talked enough. Anybody else got anything else they'd like to add? I'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
I wanted to comment on, it sounds like a big influence in that movement has to do with how we judge what we just felt or not. And the judgment has to do with the clinging or getting rid of. And sometimes
that is an important insight, and that is where we're going to go. I mean, we are, as we're going down this path, and it's really, I just love when I'm listening to you guys talk and you bring up something that's later on in the sutta, because you saw it organically and spontaneously, because again, this is functioning for us. It's working. It's looking at this makes us see that. And you're right. It's about bias. There's a Zen koan that goes, the way is not difficult for one who does not pick and choose. And so that observation arises, that is vipassana, where we see from doing this and make an observation. Yeah, I think you're right. Bias is where it starts to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and those come from many places. I don't know if that's worth studying or not, because all of a sudden I could see where my judgments come from family, from society, from successes, from failures,
from compound conditions.
Yeah. And I'm working currently to reduce that kind of judgment, to just see.
And then you offer up some peace and equanimity. You offer up the space to that instead of the others. And here, where we leave off in this instruction for this week is I think it's intriguing how simple his direction has been. It's like, recognize if you're having a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling, and whether or not is in your mind or in your body. That is the place to look. And so I'd invite everybody this week to make that your practice. We've been doing this Satipatthana practice, and we focus on the breathing. Once your body becomes calm, as you notice things come and go, Victor, as you're working with your back, notice the things that are pleasant and the things that are unpleasant and the things that are neutral, and just note it. That's actually the direction, right? We make light of that around here because we say it so often, but just noting it is what the recommendation is. Linda, you got something? Looks like you want to say something.
Well, I was just kind of thinking. You're talking about, we're talking about body, mind, so physical, mental. That quote that you shared, I thought it was interesting that it said it was of the flesh and not of the flesh.
Right.
So it was a different way of saying it. And I was just kind of thinking, it's like, well, is there a distinction there that we're not quite touching on yet?
That's good. Yeah, no, I think you're right in that. In fact, we're using the term mind. And so the Buddhist term for mind is citta. And we're going to talk about that really next week. That's not the same as feelings, udana. That's not the same exactly. And so it's tough because in our culture, we tend to use both, but you're right in that he doesn't even necessarily, he's not saying it's a thing that's happening in your head. He's not saying it's a thing that's happening in your head. He's just saying, well, it isn't of the flesh, right? Like, that's it. It just isn't of the flesh. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important note.
Yeah.
I have one last thing to offer, if I might.
Yeah.
Again, in the Dhammapada, and in there somewhere, I recall, it's a mind made. We make it in the mind. And this last 3 lines from this particular, it's actually in the Dhammapada, the mind. You can look it up. The last 3 stanzas. All too soon, this body will lie on the ground, cast aside, deprived of consciousness, like a useless scrap of wood. Whatever an enemy may do to an enemy, or a haters one to another, far worse is the harm from one's own wrongfully directed mind. Whether neither mother nor father, nor any other relative can do one as much good as one's own well-directed mind.
And that is true. And it's that quote is a big tease for next week. Next week we dive into mind. So for sure. So Satu, anybody else got anything else? I'm happy to stick around and share. Otherwise, I'm going to share our service presentation stuff and we will conclude for today. And as usual, conclude with some reflections on universal well-being. May we abide in well-being, in freedom from affliction, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may we maintain well-being in ourselves. May everyone abide in well-being, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may they maintain well-being in themselves. May all beings be released from all suffering, and may they not be parted from the good fortune they have attained. When they act upon intention, all beings are the owners of their action and inherit its results. All beings are owners of their future is born from such action, companion to such action, and its results will be their home. All actions with intention, be they skillful or harmful, of such acts they will be the heirs. And we'll conclude with the salutations of the Triple Jam. Araham Sama Sambuddho Bhagava Buddham Bhagavantam Abhivademi. Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammam Namasami. Supatipanno Bhagavato Sawaka Sangho Sangham Namami. Thanks for practicing with me, guys. Hope you have a good week. We'll see you next week. Practice this week with that if you can. As you notice, note pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And we'll talk about it next week.